Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the panel and publication launch of The Place Where the Creek Goes Underground. I'm Meg Rotzel, the curator of exhibitions here at the Radcliffe. We're honored to welcome Deanna Ledezma, Josh Rios, and Anthony Romero, who make up the Place as Practice Research Collective. This event is part of Arts Thursday, a university-wide initiative for free public art events every Thursday evening, supported by the Harvard University Committee on the Arts. We would like to thank them for making this program possible. I'd also like to welcome friends, colleagues, and family and relations who are watching online. The exhibition on view gathers objects, video, family photographs, sound, and writings to reflect on the complexities of kinship as related to place. When you visit, you'll encounter natural materials like gravel, cedar leaves, and a living rosemary plant, all referencing the land and relationships that I expect our speakers will address today. Key to this program is the publication that accompanies the exhibition, authored by all three, designed by Kara Buzzle, and edited by Caitlin Rubin, my co-curator for this exhibition. Each of you will receive a copy, and those of you who are online may request one. This exhibition began as a conversation about land and gardens. Anthony had been working on a project about gentrification and a community garden in East Boston, and I was curious about his take on the concept of a garden, a cultivated place, a collaboration between plant and person. Over time, the Place Where the Creek Goes Underground took shape together with Anthony and his collaborators, Deanna and Josh, and I'm going to introduce them briefly before we start this program. Anthony Romero is an artist, writer, and organizer committed to documenting and supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Anthony is faculty at Dartmouth College, resides in Boston, and was a fellow at the Radcliffe in 2019 and 2020. Dr. Deanna Ledezma is a Latinx scholar, writer, and educator specializing in Latinx studies, the history and theory of photography, contemporary art, and visual culture. She lives in Chicago and is the postdoctoral research associate and writing lab director of the Crossing Latinidades Humanities Research Initiative at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Josh Rios is an educator, media artist, and writer whose projects deal with the histories, archives, and futurities of Latinx subjectivity and U.S.-Mexico relations as understood through the intersections of modernity, postmodernity, and neocolonialism, and Josh is faculty at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Anthony, Deanna, and Josh co-founded Place as Practice to conduct, quote, critical and creative kinship research and produce visual and narrative-based work. And they have all created writing, artworks, exhibitions, and publications together and as individuals. And I encourage you to visit the exhibition website to learn more. The Place Where the Creek Goes Underground was initiated at Radcliffe as an aspect of the university-wide climate initiative. And this exhibition and publication provides a specific site to consider, the region between South Central Texas and northern Mexico, where our guests' families have lived for generations. Those of you who have visited the gallery will have noticed specific material and images that index that landscape. Cedar branches, a living rosemary plant, and gravel are paired with photography, sound, ephemera, and archival materials that reference the Texas Hill Country. These materials are highlighted by the richness of the life writing that is sown throughout the exhibition. And I quote Deanna here to describe the significance of this narrative as a form of autobioethnography, testimonio, and autohistoria teoria that examine the entanglements of personal experience and social relationships, familial and collective histories, territory, and emplacement. I am looking forward to this conversation. So here is how the next hour will go. First, Anthony will ground us in the concepts that surround the publication and exhibition, and Deanna and Josh will join, followed by an audience Q&A. And so, since I know that we have a very engaged audience here and online, I expect a lot of questions. So for those of you who can use the Q&A feature on Zoom, And you can use that Q&A feature on Zoom. And those of you who are in the room, please submit your questions through Slido. You can see that QR code right up there. And I ask that you keep your questions short, and this will increase the likelihood that we can address as many as possible in the short time that we have. And so now I will turn the floor over to Anthony and Black.
Hello, good evening. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you braving the cold. Hey, good to see you. I appreciate you braving the cold. We keep it chill. I appreciate you braving the cold, which I was not properly dressed for. So my name's Josh. Sorry, my name's Anthony. Thank you. This is a microphone. We did say earlier that we were just going to start hyphenating all of our names just to make it easier. We are not interchangeable, though, and we will start with some brief introductions of ourselves, just to place ourselves a bit more in the landscape. We'll do some reading, a little bit of reading from the broadsheet, and try to just kind of contextualize a bit more of the ideas in the show, just so that we have a sense, briefly. If you've seen the show, would you mind raising your hand? Okay, great. That's like half the folks. We'll try to kind of clarify any of the pieces in the show for those who haven't seen. So my name's Anthony. I was born in Austin, Texas, and I was raised in the Texas Hill Country. My family is indigenous to the Texas-Mexico border. That's where we've lived for as long as we've been in this world. I grew up in a small rural town. Most of my family were farm workers. My parents began working in the fields when they were 7 to pay for school supplies. We can think of this as a kind of a typical rural upbringing in the sense that there were peaks and valleys economically. There were certainly some lean years. I said before that my mother, she probably won't watch this, so I'll go ahead and say it again, that my mother would never say that we were poor. That was against the rules. But we certainly were broke, which was kind of her concession in the matter. And, was first-gen college student, not just the first one to go to school, but also the first one to leave that place. Hopefully by the end of this talk and after seeing the exhibition, the place, if you're unfamiliar with it, has more clarity and a bit more depth. Met Josh and Deanna, we'll say more about this specifically shortly, but met Josh and Deanna in undergraduate school at Texas State University, which is the other state school in Texas. That's important to note. Not because I have a chip on my shoulders, but just because it says something about the landscape of my undergraduate education that we went to the other state school, which was not UT. We began, well, maybe I'll hold off on that. I'll leave it there. Why not pass it to you, Deanna?
Okay. Hi, my name's Deanna Ledezma. I grew up in Kerrville, Texas, which is in the Texas Hill Country, northwest of San Antonio. I am the first person, the first generation to be born in the United States on my father's side. My father, Joe Ledezma, who is pretty prevalent in the exhibition and also a kind of narrator in the essay that I wrote for the exhibition catalog. He and his family immigrated from Musquis, Coahuila, Mexico, in northern Mexico, to the Texas Hill Country in the late 1960s. They secured work first at a pecan orchard where they lived and worked, and subsequently at a guest ranch, which, if you're familiar or not with guest ranches, these are kind of agro-tourist spaces where people can experience something akin to a Southwestern relaxation of horseback riding, steak dinners, things like that. And my family lived and worked there, my grandparents in particular, for about 27 years. And I would also say that in moving from Texas to Chicago for grad school, I may have made one of the longest geographical journeys, because a lot of my family, as with Anthony's family, has resided in this part of what is now Mexico for centuries, really going back as far as any kind of genealogical study can confirm. What about you, Josh?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name's Josh Rios, and like like all of us in some way here on the stage, at any rate, my family also kind of has deep and long roots around the Gulf Coast, of Texas, which of course kind of connects to the Gulf Coast in general, like of Louisiana as well, and has spent most of their kind of, or I guess I come from or emerged from a sort of like group of people who have lived along the Gulf Coast and into central Texas, with ties that go down to like central Mexico and also to Coahuila as well, and San Luis Potosi, like Anthony and Deanna, or Josh, the other Josh. I went to state school as well, as first generation student as well, and also made a kind of a different kind of migration north to Chicago, which is also over the past decade become another kind of home. So that I think that kind of trying to just emplace ourselves in a kind of particular landscape, and like both of you all as well, sort of the formation of my subjectivity, I'll say, has a lot to do with the formation of two nation states and their overlapping kind of ness around the U.S.-Mexico border, in quotes, and the kind of the various degrees of sort of like separation and overlapping that place sort of is defined by, from the sort of mid 1800s, let's say, up into the current times. So I feel like that's part of my placement as well, the sort of problematics of kind of settler colonialism and Latin American colonialism as well.
Deanna, do you want to say a little bit more about how we started working together?
Sure. So we really, when we think about the origins both of our friendships and also of our collaborations, it begins at Texas State University in a lecture hall, as some relationships first occur, and the history of photography, actually taught by Erna Dugan, who we have since collaborated with, has worked as an editor for books that we've contributed to, things like that. We were all studying art history at the time, trying to find our footing within a discipline that we didn't quite see ourselves or our histories in, but we're nonetheless very keen to investigate art history, cultural studies, visual culture, all of those things. But really, it was Anthony who first moved to Chicago for grad school, to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for a performance studies degree. And in going just 1 year ahead of us, he really set a path for what might be possible for all three of us who were first generation college students. And so in many ways, you showed us a way to potentially have a life outside of Texas, although I think in many ways we've been finding ways of returning, hence the project titles of like returning as research. But initially you gave us a way to really think about what it might be like to study long term and with people like each other.
And maybe too, our beginnings go back again, like kind of historically, in terms of how we think of ourselves as related, or as kind of in a kind of kinship that exceeds, let's say, biological sort of formations, as far as how family is constructed, and also like legal formations around how family is constructed. But seeing ourselves as related, both because we come from a similar place, but also because we're all sort of formed under similar, although differences as well. I don't want to just flatten out everything.
Sure.
But formed under this kind of similar social, historical conditions and social historical pressures, let's say.
Yeah, and we were actually just at a book reading with Sandra Rees for her new book, Left Turns in Brown Study, and she used this term primahood to describe to a person who she really sees as a kind of kin, who she also met at a university, and that resonated like quite a bit for us in thinking about the way that we describe or even attempt to name the kind of collaborative and social relations that we've established with each other.
Oh, and prima just means cousin.
Cousin.
In case you're not familiar with that sort of whatever.
A kind of chosen kin term.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I want to piggyback off that and think a little bit about kinship research, which is how we've been thinking about a lot of this, a lot of the work that ended up inside of the exhibition. But before I do that, maybe I'll read the beginning of the broadsheet, which is a smaller publication that we produced as a kind of exhibition essay. This is obviously the release of the larger publication, but for most of the exhibition, the broadsheet has been in the space with the objects and has been a primary mode of understanding the kind of layered histories and experiences that we're trying to map across these objects. But before I do that, I want to tell you a story. Because I realize I need to tell you a story before I tell you a story. And that story is that a couple of years ago, I was meeting with indigenous and Chicano artists and administrators, and I was trying to understand a lot of things that we don't have time for now. But as I am often wont to do when I'm trying to understand something, I needed to visit with others. And I needed to use the mode of the visit as the means by which I might understand or build knowledge or exchange with others. And one of those folks is a person by the name of Roberto Bedoya, who's the manager of cultural affairs for the city of Oakland. And as I was talking to Roberto and trying to understand Roberto's work, he told me a story. And the story goes like this. In every city or town, there is a creek. That creek may still exist, or it may be paved over. It may be a parking lot, or a hospital, or an apartment building. But somewhere in that place, there is someone who remembers the creek, and who remembers the place where the creek goes underground. Now, Roberto goes on to say that what he's trying to do in his work is to create opportunities for that knowledge to be shared with the broadest swath of people that he can imagine. And when he told me that story, it unlocked something, as stories sometimes do. It unlocked something inside of me, and I've been gravitating towards that ever since. So this exhibition is called The Place Where the Creek Goes Underground. The Place Where the Creek Goes Underground collaboratively gathers archival collections, moving images, family photographs, sound, and multiple genres of life writing to reflect on the complexities of kinship, belonging, and place. The title of the exhibition is taken from a conversation between myself and Roberto Bedoya, in which Bedoya described how someone always holds the memory of a place, even as the built environment alters or obscures facets of the landscape. Visibility neither determines presence nor precludes what is felt and remembered. Relationship to place is expressed through many ways of knowing, including affective and experiential sensations, not contingent on the rationality of the scene. Attuned to these ways of knowing, this exhibition foregrounds place as a cultural practice. To consider a place is to reflect on localized knowledges that speak to land as a contested instrument of power and to the multi-generational temporalities that emerge from being in and of a place. And with that, Josh, I'll pass it over to you to maybe expand a little bit on some of those ideas.
I mean, I almost want to throw this away and just talk
Throw it
about
away.
what you just said, but
Throw it away.
I'll stay
That's an
on.
option.
I don't
Yeah, throw it
know.
away.
I gotta stay. Maybe I should stay true to this scratchy handwriting. So I think the next section that we wanted to discuss was like kind of what it means to work together or do things together.
Wait. Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
Can you do both? Because I'm really curious what you were about to say.
Well, I was just going to say something really simple, like what does it mean to be in proximity to someone whose sort of family, kin, and individuality was formed, subjectivity was formed through the conditions of U.S.-Mexico relations, which is not something that a lot of people may come into contact with routinely or even ever, maybe, if you're not kind of in the particular region. So I don't know. I'm not sure why that came to my mind, but maybe it was just a way of like kind of offering this. I don't know, some generosity around that, or some kind of.
Do you mean us or Roberto?
I was thinking me, but now I'm thinking us, and now I'm thinking Roberto.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to add that, in explaining, I appreciate that the show title cannot be explained without telling a story, right? Without sharing a story. Really, it's like a retelling of a story. And I can at least say in sharing this title with my father that this poetic title was also rooted in like lived experience, right? And he had this example of living near a creek and knowing that creek water wasn't drinkable, but then just following a kind of trail and digging into the earth until he reached a place where you could drink that water because he knew it would go underground and resurface. So I don't know. I think that maybe the kind of connective thread between that has something to do with how storytelling is always an act of collaboration between a speaker, a listener, and then perhaps a listener who then continues to tell that story in a new voice, in a new context, but with that story intact to some extent.
Go ahead. I mean, I was going to talk about some of them, maybe some of the, let's say, modalities that we're working in, and later on maybe more about the materialities, but one of the modalities for sure has to do with what you said, which is that storytelling is an important part, or like a kind of important framework for how we're thinking about the kind of production of exhibition and the production of like creative output, let's say, and the role that narrativity plays in something like what it means to be a witness to something, like a story that somebody tells you, and how hearing a story as a witness leads you into the terrain of, say, becoming someone who offers testimony in some kind of capacity, which gets us to this sort of theoretical but practical or practice-based kind of area of something like testimonio, which is like story but with kind of cultural gravitas to it.
Yeah, speaking back to power.
A storytelling that's that tells a personal story but also engages with dynamics of power. Which is like also kind of references this notion of autoethnography, which is important, I think, to our practice in the sense that it kind of begins with and values personal experience, but also doesn't simply stop there, but is a way of interpreting cultural experience. So valuing and sort of like, I won't say centering, but maybe centering in order to decenter personal experience as we kind of analyze how it is formed by kind of conditions of power, but also how it can help us understand like cultural context as well and cultural dynamics. So that was kind of our sort of section on sort of forms, structures, and theories.
And I would say like in looser ways and maybe less formal ways, all of those things come, of course, from genres of life writing, which then inform these creative nonfiction texts that are in the exhibition book. And although we have written together in various ways, this was the first time that we created a kind of like suite of essays together. Yeah, and a univocal like introduction and like brochure text. So, but those are some of the methods that are informing the collaborative kinds of writing that we're doing together.
I want to jump back to stories. I know you like in scene at the when you close, but yeah, I want to jump back to stories, and I want to think through stories to get to the archive, because that's a big part of the show. But before I do that, I maybe just want to say anecdotally, we had this lunch with students earlier today, and it was a great conversation. So shout out all the students that came to the lunch and all of their great questions. And before we really got started, you mentioned this thing of going to Texas and not being quite so accustomed to the air conditioning and then opening the windows and being hit by all that pollen and having an allergy attack. And I thought, well, that's so interesting because my father works in HVAC, right? He was a heating and air conditioning person. And my parents have this turbo air conditioner, which is incredibly loud for their very small house. But as you might expect from an air conditioned man, it's like a giant air conditioner, and the house is very cold. Living in New England for as long as I have, I've gotten quite accustomed to having the windows open. But the windows in my childhood bedroom are sealed. And they're sealed because when I was a child, my mother would tell me the story of La Chusa, which is a witch that can transform into animals. And she would tell me that the witch would come to the tree, which was outside of my bedroom window, at night in the form of this bird. And that's why we had to keep the windows closed. So when you said that, I remembered this story. I remember my mother telling me these stories of the witch who could transform into birds that would be hiding in the trees. And in a lot of ways, when I think about the work that we're doing, when I think about kinship research and I think about storytelling, I think in many ways it has to do with taking all of these stories that happen around kitchen tables and at bedsides and at family gatherings and at barbecues and cookouts and all of this, taking all of those stories as truth, as knowledge being exchanged and being expressed. And there is an aspect of our work that I think is, on the one hand, us, or to speak for myself as part of this trio, is like wrestling with how I want to tell you the story. And in my mind, when I went for a walk a couple of days ago, it had kind of tears to it. You know, I want to tell you a story. I am trying to tell you a story. I am telling you a story, right? That I'm wrestling constantly with how to articulate these things that I feel, that I know to be true. And the relationship between that experience and the kind of historical legacy of a place, or the socioeconomics reality of that place, or, you know, as Josh says, like just generally that experience's relationship to power. So, because it's something that we also wrote about in the broadsheet, is like, maybe Deanna, if you want to take us to that place of like what it is to visit with our family, to hear these stories, to think about these stories in relationship to the development of a kind of archive, which we can dig into a little bit.
Sure. Well, should I start by reading the section about kinship research? Okay. So this is from the broadsheet, obviously. Our visual and narrative-based practice, which we describe as kinship research, is the foundation of an ongoing multimedia project conceptualized as a collective memoir, written and made with one another and generations of our relatives. Informed by the storytelling practices of autoethnography, testimonio, and autohistoria theoria, kinship research critically examines the entanglements of personal experience and social relationships, familial and collective histories, territory, and emplacement. Through this collaborative practice, we accentuate kinship formations that transcend judicial and biological notions of family. Kinship research includes driving down back roads, following routes committed to memory, gazing at the unfurling landscape through car windows, and getting out to look more closely. It propels subsequent trips to libraries, archives, databases, online auctions, and spaces of cooperative dialogue. It is characterized by sharing meals made with or brought to family members, by walking through yards and fields with video cameras, snapping photographs of extant and approximate buildings and properties referenced in family stories, by conversing via echoing speakerphones and video calls.
Yeah, and I mean, we kind of mentioned some of those things earlier, so that's good to hear them again. And maybe one thing that I don't know what it means, but we made it up, which is this idea of a collective memoir. Like, I'm not sure what that is yet. So there's all this stuff about like kind of being in process and thinking together, that some stuff is unresolved and or is kind of in the kind of throes of being I don't know, formulated, let's say. And I think that has a lot to do with our interest in archives, but in the way that archives are assemblages of kind of different nodes that any person can come up to and connect in different ways to get a different kind of story. So both the limitations of that, but also the generative kind of aspects of that. So in the exhibition, you will see a lot of kind of like, I don't know, like archival adjacent strategies that bring together artifacts, images, and kind of like a vitrine-like amalgamations in a way as to invite people, audiences, or even ourselves in a certain way, to make kind of different sort of connections to tell different kinds of stories, some of them that may be kind of known to us and some that may not be known to us. So I don't know if that kind of gets us into this sort of archival territory that we wanted to sort of get into, and how that relates to something like the writing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, when we were talking about like the choice to include books, right? Books that we read together or think through or want each other to read within the exhibition, we really thought about them as kind of tangible citations, not just for ourselves, but for other folks as well. And this accumulation of ephemera that then begins to constitute an archive is something that actually all three of us have been doing through different kinds of collaborative work over the years. But with this one, in many ways, it felt like, you know, where do you go when you can't quite situate a very local or particular history within an institutional archive? Like, how do you build around that? And even thinking about, Josh and I went to the Harry Ransom Center in September to try and maybe locate some things relevant to our research. And of course, we did find collections relevant, but never things in which we would see ourselves represented in any kind of way, not to mention a way that felt like realistic to our lived experiences. And I would say if there's an archivist or librarian who would like to point us toward one of those kind of sources, of course I welcome them, because archives are never easy to navigate in terms of what they contain. But Anthony, you had said this idea of like the seed as an archive. Could you elaborate on that point that you made earlier today?
Yeah, I was just trying to think of how to put it together, and maybe because I'm like on a stage now and I have a microphone, and we've been joking about like how folksy we want to be in this academic
How
environment.
many y'alls we can utter?
Yeah. Like if we should really play it up for y'all.
0.
That I feel inclined just to tell you more stories.
There's a fireplace in the next room if we need to gather.
I'm completely derailed myself. And but you know, I think because it came up earlier today in the conversation at lunch, I did feel the need to clarify what we might mean by an archive. Because in this kind of context, I think we think of capital A archive, right? We think of the kinds of institutional archives which we have visited to produce some of this work and to produce some of our writing. You have to make appointments, and you have to be careful how you touch things and get permissions to photograph things and all this kind of stuff. All the kind of colonial, bureaucratic machinery around what it means to hold and protect things. But that's not really what I mean. And in the publication, I am wrestling with this idea of the archive in relationship to photography, specifically through a story of this really unremarkable collection of family photographs that my mother keeps. Not because there's anything unremarkable about my particular family, but because there's nothing precious about it. Because it's a black trash bag full of envelopes, like fat envelopes of photographs. And it exists in the back of a small closet under old Christmas decorations. You know, there's nothing precious or romantic about it. And really, if it wasn't for me wanting to pull those things out every Christmas to hear the stories, they would probably live there until we had to clean out my parents' house. But I mean that kind of archive. You know, I mean the kinds of archives which maybe we're all more familiar with, that has to do with the accumulation of a life, right? That has to do with what it means to be a ball of tape moving through the world and collecting things and experiences and stories. And again, I think like a certain kind of resignation, like a resignation to allowing the residue of a life to build up, right? That kind of archive, I think, is what, when I think about our work, I think that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, that I think we're interested in. And again, I think it goes back to these stories, to these family histories, to these narratives. So, for example, the other story that I was going to tell you is that my maternal grandmother, in her jewelry box, kept a small collection of arrowheads. And when I found these arrowheads and asked about them, I was told that this collection of arrowheads were found all along my grandmother's property. I was just seeing if the photograph was up so I could show you. Now, I asked my father about this, and my father said, as a child, anywhere they dug, they would find pieces of pottery, they would find arrowheads, they would find all these things. And it was clear to them that where my grandmother's house was a former campsite. When they went to the historical society in their small town, they were met with disbelief, as my father tells me. And the local historian said, there's absolutely no way this was a campsite. We would have known if this was a campsite. And they dismissed my father's family. So if we think about that relationship between what I just said about this kind of quotidian archive in relationship to the capital A archive, and I think what I've been attempting to articulate to you all in terms of like taking these things seriously, when you're sitting at the dinner table, when you're sitting at Thanksgiving with your family or whatever, like taking these stories seriously, that for me gets articulated in that, right? Like if my father and his brother had been taken seriously, what would that have looked like? Like how would that have shifted the relationship that our family has to that town? How would that validated generations of history, of local knowledge, right? Like all kinds of things might have emerged from that, but they haven't, and they would be dismissed. And so as our family, this is another story which we don't have time for, but as our family will eventually lose that plot of land, so too will the campsite be gone. So all of this, I think, is like what we're attempting to wrestle with in relationship to things like archives, in relationship to kinship research, to family histories and narratives. But you have more to add?
And maybe also the last thing about that is just to think in terms of like performance studies and how there's a kind of critique around this sort of scriptocentric version of the archive, the one that's like official, written, and to value all the other kind of archival practices that exist through like oral traditions or even like, embodiments, performances, kind of what Diana Taylor calls the repertoire versus the archive, the performed, the embodied, the enlivened, the lived through, and the way that's all communicated and passed down in a kind of form of living tradition or something like that versus this sort of static, I'm going to steal your language, this sort of static glare, let's say, of the archive.
Oh, the archival glare.
The archival glare when you're like in there and there's like plastic on things and the lighting is over the top and you can't see anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you can't photograph anything because it's all just light reflecting up and down.
But it's also glaring back and disdain or disregard for the other histories that have been deemed too insignificant or, out of bounds. Okay, and then we're at time.
Yeah, I think we are at a place to transition.
Yes.
I could talk about this stuff forever, and it has been a total privilege to work with all three of you and to be part of putting the exhibition together because a lot of this can be very subtle in the work itself, and yet it reveals itself throughout. So please do visit the exhibition. And we've had, I want to remind folks to use Slido and the Q&A button, and I can see that we have lots of, there's lots of folks here. So I'm going to try to combine these questions so we can know as much as we can from these questions. Okay, so here's one that actually connects to the archive and the exhibition. Can the speakers describe how the exhibition deploys unfamiliar senses of temporality or deep time? And I'm thinking about how in an earlier conversation with students, you were talking about going underground and the creek going underground. Is there a stretching of time here? And other folks have also asked about history and time. And I know that you think about futurity. So what in the exhibition is doing that, and how are you thinking about time?
Okay, so that's a good question because I teach this class every year called Decolonizing Time Travel. And partially it is about this sort of, I don't know how to put this except to say a big weird word, which is heterotemporality, or like the way many times exist at once in the way that materials from another time, a bygone era, can be present with us in the moment, and how just by being in its presence, there is a kind of sense of being in two places at once, in two times at once. And I think that is one of the things I do like about archives and histories, even the bad archive with the capital A, or however you want to put that. The that idea of I think you had put it too, or somebody put it in the introductory text, a way of like kind of collapsing time, but not flattening its nuances.
Oh, the Boston Arts Review.
Oh, the Boston
Yeah.
Art Review. I think I liked
Jameson,
that.
yeah.
Jameson's text too. So that's kind of my sort of response to that. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, when I think about the kind of archive that I have been co-assembling with you all, particularly about like guest ranches in the Texas Hill Country, many of those like predate my own family's arrival to the United States, but I sort of see these representations as a precursor to their labor, which will continue to be invisibilized for decades after, in the kind of, let's say, like postcards that circulate or brochures. And then, I mean, to reference an image on the screen, I think about my father's own kind of archive keeping with these two spools of barbed wire that he's kept from fences that his father had put up on this land. And even my grandfather's choice to, if a tree absolutely had to be cut, which for my father and my grandfather was a real shame, it was not something that they ever wanted to do, but if it deemed absolutely necessary, they would keep them like waist high. They never wanted to take them down to like the bottom because they wanted people to understand the amount of time that tree took to grow, right? And so I just think about like all the temporalities and even ideas of maybe vernacular archive making that happened just in this one image here that we've sort of chosen to use to circulate for the show. But Anthony, what would you say?
Yeah. I'm not sure what is meant by deep time. That feels like specific language. I do think when we think about time, yeah, I wrestled with this a little bit too in the essay. Like photography has a relationship to time. You know, it does the things that Deanna was just talking about. But because you brought up seeds earlier, because I brought up seeds earlier, when I think about time in relationship to the work that we do, I think about it more like a seed, right? Because a seed is a time travel device that we're all very familiar with, right? In the sense that like it is literally the product of the plant which produced it, right? Like it is literally a consequence of its past, but it's also the potential for what grows next. And in this way, you know, quite beautifully, the seed is just waiting for us to be ready to participate in that strange occurrence of past and present meeting simultaneously in the present, right? And so I think that there is something, when I think about time, I certainly don't want to think about it in a linear sense. I think I want to think about it in these more layered.
Yeah, and not in a circular sense too. That's oftentimes the kind of natural go-to in terms of a critique of like linear time. Is like time is this, some kind of cyclical thing, which that could be true. I'm not saying that's not true, but I feel like this other kind of version of simultaneity maybe of time is kind of because even a circle still goes in a line. Well, I mean, that's the problem to me. It's not about lines. It's about layers, but not to be like kind of thinking about like some problem of stratification or where things are easily separatable. You know, like layers is often like a layer cake. It's like, there's the ganache, there's the raspberry, and there's the cake. It's not like that kind of layering either. You know, it's a layer that's fully imbricated as well.
Well, I'm thinking about the kitchen table and how the different people sitting around that table are reaching into different time because they've had different experiences. Their core, they're together. But when I see my kid, I'm like, wow, you are going to be punted out into a place that I won't have access to, but I do, like the seed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I feel like we have to reel in the like. Okay.
Well, no. So okay. So this is.
Give us a question grounded in fact.
I do have. Yeah.
Wait, can I say something about circles? Because this, I think, is like quite interesting.
Because these things show up.
Because it's a matter of perspective, right? Like if you're looking at a circle straight on, it appears to stay in place. But if you look at a circle from a side, you might identify a spiral. And that's part of the changing of the orientation.
Yeah. Okay, so I will ground this in stuff that is in the gallery. So there's different questions around, like we've already addressed a certain amount about the archival materials, but we have questions about the color palette that's in there. There is a pink ground and a yellow sky? I don't know. And then within the publication, there's these colors that are repeated. And then throughout the exhibition, if there's different forms that you can see echoed across. There's the metal, there's the materiality. But can you address the kind of the palette that you were working with? Anthony, I think this one's
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious, Yael's impression. Just because to clarify for everyone with the knowing glance, it was just that there was a division of labor, and since I'm local, I was in charge of helping to choose that color scheme and helping to kind of design the exhibition. Josh and Deanna were in Chicago. You know, the idea is that there are formal relationships between everything in the gallery. So if you haven't seen the gallery, one of the things that you'll see is a large photo mural of a trash can that is in a cemetery that has some discarded plastic flowers in it. Those flowers are pink and yellow. You'll also see that a similar pink and yellow flower are embedded within the inner tube vitrines, what I'm calling vitrines. But you'll also see a similar pink flower on top of a blue stump in a photograph that's in the corner. So there's a kind of nesting, there's like a formal nesting. I know not everyone is gonna identify those things. If you look at the inner tube that is in the center of the space, if you looked closely enough, you would identify a metal bullfrog under the plexiglass that is pointing towards one of the panels. You don't need to. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to. But if you did, you'd be like, what is that bullfrog trying to tell me? And then you'd go over to that panel maybe and you would think about it in a different way, right? In the same way that if you were standing with your back to the windows and you were facing the photo mural, you might see in your field of vision the repeating plastic flowers. So,
or the shine of the aluminum trash can, then meeting a parallel line of the aluminum planter bed that serves as a vitrine that is then filled with not only archival materials, but probably much to the dismay of conservators or archivists, living materials. Yeah. Oh, it's okay.
Cedar.
That's the joy of having of being, the like quote unquote owner of these materials. It's like, yeah, we can go ahead and put that 100-year-old photograph in a.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. No, it's good. It's
and too, if you look at this photo mural very closely, you'll see like a grasshopper,
which we had not seen until today.
Yeah,
at that
but
scale.
then in the vitrine there is a metal grasshopper.
Yeah. So there's
I'm just saying.
So-
that is in a molcajete that
Yeah.
when Josh and Deanna sent me the photo of this object they wanted to send, it included a grasshopper.
A real grasshopper had jumped
grasshopper
into the
that had jumped
molcajete as we were photographing it to show Anthony. And so then it's just like all of these things.
So I can say, as the person who's been bringing folks on tour, that over a long period of time, which is really an hour and 15 minutes, there's a lot of identification of these things. So I feel gratified that people are like, wait, wow. And just the fact that you have that this text is wheat pasted onto the boards that hold the books. Like, there is this like ongoing kind of textual machine is a terrible spiral that's happening. So I think aesthetically all of these things work, and I find it so interesting that the three of you have such different ways of expressing your relationship with archives, your way of constituting an archive, of speaking about that, and I have to also say that there is sound in the exhibition, and there's literally the voices of your kin that are audible. So there's this layering.
And the voices of insects.
Yes. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to end it there, but you've got your publications. And so I'm going to read this now.
Yeah.
This concludes our program today. And I really, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for being here and for sharing with us. And thank you to the audience for terrific questions. And I also want to thank the exhibition team in AB&E and Joe Zane and Caitlin Rubin for their care and expertise. And I invite you all to come back and look at the exhibition. It is open until 7 p.m. tonight, so go across the way, and is open through December 14th. And this program has been recorded, so if you've registered, you'll be able to get it into your inbox in about a week. And for upcoming Radcliffe programs, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. And thank you all for being here, and thanks to our audiences for joining online.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.